Salam alaikum, greetings to everybody, from one Charlie to another. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of a historical topic, but hopefully one that'll bring us up to speed. Is where we began in South Africa with the dynamic spectrum assignment and how that leads on to the current work. My colleague, I think, will be speaking tomorrow, giving you a lot more detail in the current framework. That's a fairly old band plan now. It's about 10 years old, but it just gives you some idea of how congested a number of those bands are. So what's the approach that we use in South Africa to assign spectrum and allocate spectrum? So that's where I thought I would start. The allocation framework in South Africa obviously primarily derives from the work that comes out of the ITU. So we have in place a national radio frequency plan. The current version is a 2021 version, which takes into account the outcomes of WRC 19. We are in the process of completing the update to cater for the outcomes of WRC 23. A second draft has recently been released and is up for consideration. What I thought I would just show you is the kind of thing that you will see, or the kind of entry you will see in our national radio frequency plan. It's related to one of the bands that we are looking at for our dynamic spectrum assignment sandbox. And it specifies the kinds of uses, the primary and secondary assignees in the band, and some kind of notes as to how they would be deployed. So out of that national radio frequency plan, typically what comes out is an IMT roadmap, which sets forward the way in which we will deal with assignment of spectrum to IMT services, and a frequency migration plan, which tends very much to be migration out of the band so that IMT can move in, unfortunately, but that's the way things go. In order to properly assign spectrum to licensees, we then develop a series of radio frequency spectrum assignment plans. I hope you two can say it without pausing for breath. That then sets the scene for specific assignment. Sharing within the bands is currently permitted, but the law does not allow us to actually have active trading of spectrum. The process that we follow in assigning spectrum and developing the plans is typically what we call a notice and comment process. Tends to be quite a lengthy one, but you will see what happens is a notice gets issued for stakeholders to input and comment. The inputs and comments are then taken through public hearings, and then revisions are made. So it can be a very lengthy process. Typically, you're talking about 9 months to 18 months to get a regulation through. It is a bit slow. So our journey for dynamic spectrum assignment began with our work on TV white spaces. That's just a map of what was estimated to be available for TV white space assignment. The blue is good. That's where there's plenty of spectrum. The red is relatively congested. I'm not going to explain to you how TV white spaces work. I think most people are familiar, but that's the kind of architecture that we had in place when we set up our framework. So you will see there's a database that really controls the assignment and then makes the spectrum available in local areas. Excuse me. Unfortunately, I have to bend down every time I need a wetting of the mouth. So the process began back in around about 2013 with a TV white space trial. One of the first ones was in Cape Town and looked to see whether TV white spaces offered an opportunity to get access to spectrum. ICASA was involved, but there were a number of other entities involved in that particular process. The CSIR, our National Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, some of the OEMs were involved in that particular process. The results were that you could get fast, reliable broadband access. Bear in mind this is 2013. The kind of bandwidth you see there is not what's considered fast and reliable today. The geographic geolocation database worked effectively, and so there were recommendations to develop a framework for TV white space deployment in South Africa. The process, as you can see here, I don't necessarily going to go through everything. I've spoken about the trials. It then led to a discussion paper that followed. There are hyperlinks on the ones that are underlined. The objective there was to make spectrum available for local deployment to support South Africa's goal of broadband for all. We have a very different kind of geography. That then led to a position paper and then to regulations. A request for proposals was issued, and out of that, a database was developed by the CSIR, which ran the deployments and was then subsequently handed over to ICASA. We also developed a framework for secondary databases. It was originally considered that might be a market. To my knowledge, and I stand to be corrected, none of those have ever been issued. We really work currently off the primary database. I'm not going to talk to this slide. This is just the CSIR's overview of the process. So how did TV white space implementation in South Africa come, or how did it play itself out? There was diminishing availability of spectrum in the sub 694 megahertz band, partly because of digital migration and restacking, and partly also because analog TV still continues to transmit in South Africa. The uptake was considerably less than what we originally expected. I was trying to get a comprehensive list. I think Paul might be able to assist me, but there were very few licenses awarded to my knowledge. 3 of them, Mtinte Communications, Morai, and Levin, which now subsequently became AABA, were signed during COVID to operate TV white spaces. Others include AdNotes and Indico. But the real problem that held back the deployment of TV white spaces was the cost of the equipment. The reports that we get is it was very expensive, and so there have been rather limited deployments of TV white spaces. There are a lot of international developments. We've heard from the other Charles about the CBRS. We've heard from Ofcom about their shared access licenses and local access licenses. I understand, but I haven't been able to follow up recently, that there has been some research in the United States suggesting that assignment could actually be done on a millisecond by millisecond basis. And so there was a proposal to use the 3.6 gigahertz band in South Africa, but that got overtaken by subsequent developments. I thought I'd just put this slide here so you can see the availability of bands that have been assigned or allocated to IMT, some of which have been assigned. The one column shows bands that have been set aside for IMT. The other column shows how much of that band has been assigned to mobile operators. So moving on from that TV white space deployment, we then developed a process to deploy dynamic spectrum assignment using a regulatory sandbox approach. And so out of the original process, there was a findings document. This is out of the TV white spaces process, but we then began to pick up the process for other bands more recently, in other words, non-TV bands. So that began with a discussion document in 2013, a findings and position paper, I beg your pardon, 2023, a findings and position paper 2024, draft regulations in early this year, 2025, and very recently invitation to stakeholders to participate in coexistence simulation studies to see whether coexistence in the bands was available. You'll see the two bands that we're particularly looking at. One of us is 3.8 to 4.2, and the other one is the lower 6 band. So the discussion document initially didn't narrow in very tightly on bands and ask stakeholders to give their views. There were some 17 written submissions. The move towards dynamic spectrum assignment in bands above the broadcast bands was widely supported. There was a view about or support for a secondary spectrum market regime and the price determination to be done by market forces. So the proposals that emerged out of that discussion really focused on two bands, the 3.8, 4.2, which is currently primarily used by fixed satellite services downlink, but also some broadband fixed wireless access fixed links in the band. The lower 6, primarily also used by fixed satellite services, but for uplink, also some broadband fixed wireless access in the band, and more recently RLAN, where we actually moved to open up the lower 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi networks. So it's seen as those two bands as a foundation for existing critical satellite services. The FSS needs to remain in place, but also an area of new digital possibilities. The idea is to work through assignment via technology agnostic dynamic spectrum access database, a long kind of acronym there. Technology access on the fact that in South Africa we do not assign spectrum according to specific generations of technology in IMT. So we don't say 2G, 3G, 4G. We may set certain parameters, in other words, whether it's TDD, time division duplex, or time division or frequency, FDD. And then there would obviously be things like power limitations, etc., on the bands, but it's a technology agnostic approach. So that database should work with the spectrum that's available and requires obviously the satellite FSS people in the band to file the spectrum that they're using, and the same thing would go with broadband fixed access networks. So the recommendations obviously need to take in that issue on board of interference management. We work closely or adhere closely to the recommendations of the ITU, to the various technical standards and international best practice. Some of the key considerations of how that database or what will be looked at in the database is the location of the proposed wireless access system, the radio propagation characteristics. There's obviously distance checks between where the spectrum was requested and where existing incumbents have spectrum. We also in South Africa, a particular issue for us, and it relates to this band, but it also relates more broadly to where things like DTD, D2D and LEO come in, is that we have certain exclusion areas in South Africa for the square kilometre array, what is sometimes known as the Karoo Central Astronomy Advantage area. So we need to make sure that those are protected so that the astronomers can do the work that's necessary. We have a number of neighboring countries, so obviously we need to make sure that we don't interfere with services in neighboring countries, and we need to look at adjacent bands both above and below, and that's where the issue of radar altimeters would come into play. So the incumbent services should be protected if registered in that database, and obviously the key emphasis will be on safeguarding fixed satellite service operators. That's just a little bit of an outline. I'm not really going to speak to it. The approach that we're working on is a regulatory sandbox approach, which is why, for example, you'll see the coexistence studies that are currently about to kick off. I think the date's in January sometime. 26th of January, yeah, around about that particular time. So what are the next steps that are going to come out of this? Obviously, the field trials need to be completed, and that will give us a lot of input into what will become the final position paper, the specifications and requirements for this, and I hate these things, reference geolocation spectrum database, another long acronym, will be the prototype specification will be developed, and finally we'll move to a full regulatory framework for dynamic spectrum assignment, hopefully in the 2 bands that we have currently identified. My colleague will be talking a little bit much more in detail about the technology and the actual detail of the process. She's the chair of the council committee that's working on it. I'm just a poor fellow councillor who has to try and comment on what comes out of their council committee. So that's the end of my presentation. I should have added in a shukran at the end, but thank you very much for the presentation. If you need to reach out to me, that's my email address at the bottom. Thank you.